everyone. Welcome to episode 129 of the Trading Without Borders podcast. In today's episode, we will be exploring how emerging technologies are shaping trade in Africa and unlocking the full potential of the AFCFTA. We will examine the impact, challenges, and benefits of digital trade across the continent and share key recommendations for policymakers on effectively implementing the AFCFTA Digital Trade Protocol. Today, we are going to be joined by our esteemed guest, Uche Anyamele, a trade and technology lawyer with experience across different jurisdictions. Uche's expertise is in digital law, particularly artificial intelligence, international trade law, and trade finance. She researches and writes on African Continental Free Trade Area, AI, climate change, and digitalization. Uche is a policy group member with Center for Artificial Intelligence and Digital Policy Europe and a senior research fellow with the Center for the Study of Economies of Africa. Thank you so much, Uche, for joining us today. One of the traditions on this podcast is for our guests to greet the audience in their local language. Please go ahead and say hello to us, or greet our audience, and let us know what it means.
Okay. Hi, Omobola. Thank you very much for thank you for that introduction. I'm going to say in Igbo, there are various ways to say it's hello, right?
Yeah.
In my native dialect, the way we say it is Mazi, then the person will respond. If they are older, they will say, you say Mazi, they'll say Nde, now for Kanka and Kamarage. So that's a full greeting. But generally, Igbo people will say Kekwano or well done, Ndewo. So Ndewo is well done. Kekwano is how are you? In some people will say Imeranga, how are you doing? Then I gave you the full range of my proper village dialect greeting, the one that
Thank you. So how do I respond to Kekwano?
You would say Odima.
Odimba. Okay. Thank you, Uche, for joining us today. So I will move right into today's question. So my first question for you, Uche. According to an ODI report by Alberto Lima titled Framework to Assess the Impact of the AFCFTA Protocol on Digital Trade, the ongoing discussions surrounding the Protocol on Digital Trade under the AFCFTA are centered on developing a comprehensive framework to regulate and facilitate digital transactions, encompassing goods, services, and data across African nations. The protocol aims to address a broad spectrum of elements crucial for digital trade. These include, but are not limited to, the management and exchange of digital goods and services, commonly known as e-commerce, as well as foundational components that are essential for the smooth operation of digital transactions. Among these foundational components are rules and regulations concerning data localization, the transnational flow of data, measures for cybersecurity, and the protection of data privacy. So my question then to you is, Uche, how can emerging technologies be leveraged to enhance digital trade, ensure data security, and support regulatory compliance across the continent?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Omobola. So, I mean, I think everybody has seen the trajectory of emerging technologies. So they are reshaping traditional trade practices across the globe. So it's not even only in Africa. And they present interesting opportunities for businesses, governments, and consumers in Africa. I know there is a study that was done by Google and the IFC, and the study estimates that internet economy could add up to at least 180 billion US dollars to Africa's combined GDP by this year, so 2025. So you can see how important this question you have asked is. So I think emerging technologies would be, like smart e-commerce platforms, AI-powered logistics solutions, fintech innovations. They can serve as catalysts to transform Africa's trade landscape. They will drive efficiency, reduce costs, and streamline supply chains, making it easier for African businesses to access regional and global markets. In terms of your question, I think there are a couple of things that we're trying to tease out there. So there's how can it help with regulatory compliance? How can it help with emerging technologies, help with sort of data security? And then how can it enhance trade? So I'll start with enhancing trade. So if you look at digital payments and fintech innovation, you can see that Africa is now bustling with fintech innovation. There are a number of African startups, over the past 2 years or so, I think about 17.7%, and they raised about $2.7 billion in funding. This was as at 2023. So this kind of rapid growth that we're looking at shows that there's an escalating demand for innovative financial services, particularly cross-border payments. And you know that cross-border payment is important in facilitating intra-African trade. So if, for example, one comes to, if you look at things like blockchain-based solutions for cross-border payments in Africa, in that sort of area, there's significant growth. People are using, I would say more this time around, people are focused more on looking at things in terms of after maybe using PAPs for payment and things like that. But you can see that there was the time that there was a lot of cryptocurrency exchange, but more if you start to look at it now, one of the things that you can think about in terms of growth that is driven by cross-border transfers and how payments are made is, you look at the Pan-African payment system. So technologies that support that PAPS, the Pan-African payment system, it will help facilitate trade. So it means that me as I'm in Nigeria, I can go through a formal route to pay money to somebody in Kenya, to send me whether it is their shea butter or their traditional goods without worrying about certain costs. And so that's one way that you can see it. So innovations that are in this regard, what they do is that they play a pivotal role in accelerating trade, and they will deliver seamless, cost-effective cross-border transaction. They will reduce remittance costs, which is always a big deal when you're doing transactions, even intra-African trade transactions. And then what you will now see is that there will be economic growth as a result of it. So I can expect that with these emerging technologies, all these kind of things that I've mentioned in terms of digital payments, cross-border payments, what we know is that they will, in the near future, we can expect them to continue to revolutionize trade by providing faster, more transparent, scalable payment infrastructures. This is one of the keys to unlocking Africa's vast trade potentials. Then if you think about another way that these emerging technologies can enhance digital trade, you think about e-commerce and marketplaces. So you look at something like Jumia, that's just a clear example. When you have things like that, they are playing a key role in enhancing intra-African trade and connecting the continent to global markets, right? So even if you look at in terms of ones that are, if it's an African-focused platform, you can see how just by the fact that that e-commerce platform is present, you can see how trade within Africa can grow, as a result of just that platform in itself. So what these platforms, the emerging technologies that support this e-commerce platform, what they do is that they will enable trade e-commerce platforms, maybe like Jumia or even small scale people in terms of SMEs. They'll facilitate access to market information and reduce the time constraints faced by, for example, women traders, which we know is a big deal, So when they'll reduce trade barriers, they will improve market transparency, and they'll streamline logistics. So SMEs in particular, African businesses that are SMEs, can scale beyond their local markets. That's something that we want in Africa. Everybody's always talking about how do we scale up SMEs? How do we make sure that they have presence in different countries in Africa? So looking ahead, digital platforms will continue to drive regional integration. They will create a more connected, efficient trading ecosystem that supports the objectives of one Africa market and unlocks Africa's, vast economic potential through enhanced trade and digital inclusion. Then the third thing I would think about is if you think about drone and autonomous delivery, that's one area that emerging technology is useful. So in regions with limited infrastructure, like rural areas, AI-powered drones and autonomous vehicles can improve the transportation of goods, especially in those remote areas. So if you have the countries, if you have companies rather that use AI drones to deliver their goods, it means that they can have more reach, isn't it? So in terms of estimates, drone delivery method is anticipated to be 4 times faster than the current land or sea transport, and it can reduce carbon emissions by up to 92%, So what this does is that remote areas in Africa that are underserved in terms of trade will have more goods brought to them. But then think about the benefits for SMEs. They're going to have more sort of delivery of their goods, more businesses, more clientele. So that's one way. Then there's customs automation and trade facilitation. This one would be AI is so useful in this aspect as an emerging technology. It could streamline customs processes by automating tasks like document verification and generation of those essential trade documents, certificates of origin and things like that. It would end up helping reduce time spent at borders and improve efficiency. That's one of the things that everybody wants. Nobody wants long queues on the trade corridor. Additionally, AI can also be used to eliminate language barriers, detect patterns of fraud. In Africa, this is important in places like Nigeria, corruption and smuggling. So it'll enhance transparency and build trust in cross-border trade. So that's one ambit of the question as I was looking at it. Then in terms of, I think, in terms of supporting regulatory compliance, regulatory compliance with emerging technologies requires a kind of a flexible and collaborative approach. So you balance innovation with the need to protect public interest. So it involves, we will enhance existing regulations, investing in capacity building. The goal really is to create a regulatory environment that supports innovation while ensuring responsible use of new technologies. So in you with emerging technologies and regulatory compliance, one thing I would want to say is if we look at customs, for example, if you have a custom system that is automated, is no longer paperwork, right? And you have all of these lists, and this is a clear example of something that I think in some countries is being done. You have a list of things that people should comply with. People don't have to stand and queue up and say, do I comply with this? It's already there in the system. So once you feed in a document, the system can check it, to see that there is, you complied with the customs requirements. It is not an individual that would determine it and tell you, can you give me kickback for this? Or, oh, it doesn't comply. It removes that element of corruption and discretion that is sometimes, yes, bordering on certain things. So that's one clear area I would say that emerging technologies can help with regulatory compliance. So it makes it, yes.
Thank you, Uche. So you have showed us what AI can, in terms of being a catalyst to transform Africa's trade from revolutionizing trade to a more connected ecosystem, streamlining custom processes, amongst others. So that's going to lead me to the second question. The draft AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol aims to harmonize rules, principles, and standards to facilitate digital trade and drive Africa's digital transformation. In your view, does Africa, what key barriers rather, does Africa's, in your view, does Africa's current regulatory environment, do we have the capacity to unlock the full benefits of digital trade under AfCFTA? What key barriers must be addressed to achieve regulatory harmonization across the continent?
Yeah. So yeah, really, really good question, Omobola. Do our current regulatory environment have the capacity to unlock the full benefits of digital trade under the AfCFTA? So one of the main challenges with digital trade in Africa is, regulatory barriers, and I guess which makes this question really timely. There's inadequate regulatory and policy environment in Africa. So according to the Regional Trade Integration Index, whereas Africa is not, one of the regions with the largest number of restrictive measures to digital trade, it is the region with the least number of enabling policies. And that's important, So first, there's regulatory fragmentation. There are different countries in Africa have varying regulations on digital trade in place. They create legal discrepancies that can complicate cross-border transactions. And then secondly, you have to think about some of the laws are outdated and restrictive. Many African nations have regulations that are not aligned with the evolving landscape of digital trade. And I tell you, Omobola, the landscape is evolving. I do a lot of AI research. You'll be talking of one thing, and then next thing there is this as well, and then they come up with this. So there is that constant thing that needs to be kept up. But we don't even have the wherewithal on the continent to keep up with the evolving landscape of digital trade, leading to limitations on cross-border data flows, e-signatures, online consumer protection. Then there is also data localization and flows. Restriction on data flows and requirements to store data locally can increase operational costs and hinder cross-border digital trade. If you think about digital trade facilitation, there are issues like paperless trading, electronic authentication, and customs duties on electronic transmissions that also contribute to these regulatory barriers. And if you think of domestic data policies, that's a big one. They're including data protection, privacy regulations. They play a significant role in shaping digital trade landscape. I think one of the, so in all of these things I've mentioned, one of the key things is the lack of harmonization, okay? The lack of a comprehensive continental policy and legal framework. It prevents Africa from reaching its economic potential. But first, so I'll do two things. I'll zero in a little bit, as a little bit on the regulatory environment in Africa as it relates to digital services trade. But I'll go to your question to say, to unlock the full benefits of digital trade under the AfTA. I'm going to say, you mentioned the digital trade protocol. I think that is a key instrument if it's well implemented. But if you hold that thought, I would come back to it in a second. Okay, so whereas on average, restrictions in digital services trade in Africa, it tends to be relatively moderate. They are still relatively higher than in other regions where similar information is available. So if you look at policy areas with the largest restrictions, when we're talking of digital services trade, it has to do with infrastructure and connectivity. There's restrictions on cross-border data flows, and cross transfer of data is often found to be restrictive, sometimes prohibited. Then there's limited data protection, and then there's restriction on use of communications. If you want to understand the effects of data regulation on digital services trade in Africa, a study was conducted in 31 African countries, and the paper, the study actually assesses how data-related restrictions affect digital services imports and exports. And it was found that African countries that impose data localization, that's local storage requirements and regulations that require partner countries to have similar privacy laws, are associated with lower imports of digital services between Africa and partner countries. So this tells you that, we are indeed dealing with a regulatory environment that it may not really be functional for digital trade or may not maximize digital trade. But then here comes the digital trade protocol. It addresses some of these issues and some of these barriers. So if you look at, for example, Article 20, 21, and 22, I find that it is, it provides, in terms of a sort of a welcome, their criticisms, and maybe we'll touch upon it soon, but there are criticisms to it. Nevertheless, if Africa is able to harmonize these laws, harmonize their national laws to fit into the after protocol on digital trade, I think that we can actually be able to some extent, we can be able to unlock some of a significant benefit of digital trade, under the after. So I think in terms of unlocking the benefits, it would be harmonization is what I would say is a key thing, and because there's so much fragmentation. So in terms of that, that's kind of my take on that. It is.
Thank you, Uche.
Yeah.
Thank you, Uche. So you've mentioned that our laws are not yet aligned with the evolving digital trade landscape, and that's one area that policymakers have to look into. So we'll then move on to the third question. According to a policy analysis on AFCFTA Digital Trade Protocol by the International Institute for Sustainable Development, Africa's digital economy has the potential to reach $118 billion by 2025 and $712 billion by 2050. But realizing this growth requires closing digital gaps, especially for women and youth who play a vital role in trade. So, what measures should AFCFTA state parties implement to bridge these gaps and address key challenges that women and youth may face across border digital trade?
Yeah. Thank you, Mobla. This is the key question because it has to deal with women and youth, and the youth is a very strong kind of factor in Africa. One of the innovative features of the AFCFTA is the protocol on women and youth in trade, and that protocol makes the AFTA the first trade agreement with an autonomous and binding legal instrument on issues of women and youth traders. So it can help mainstream women and youth traders related issues on implementing the African agreement. If you look at that protocol, it can a good implementation or a measured implementation of that protocol can help to promote inclusive trade and development because of the unique demographic aspects of trade on the continent. So I had started with, Africa's population is predominantly young, representing almost 1 billion people, that's a really interesting kind of figure. The youth innovation and entrepreneurships are essential, therefore, for boosting intra-African trade and investment. If you consider that 85% of economic activity in Africa is in the informal sector, and 80% of businesses are MSMEs who are owned by women, you will see that they play an important role. And if you think of key challenges for women and youth, so there is a study by UNECA and the WTO, and that report shows that women and youth face similar challenges in Africa. And I guess that is the reason why they are put together and the protocol addresses them. So there is high transaction and information costs. There is lack of economies of scale. There's also low productivity, difficulties complying with regulations, and limited access to finance. Another report by the AFCFTA Secretariat and UNDP also showed that women traders particularly encounter difficulty. Trade information is much more difficult for women to access. They don't know how to get the information. There's then limited representation in professional networks and trade associations, as well as something that people don't often talk about in trade, sexual harassment. When women want to import or export, and they have to deal with their male counterparts. So this protocol, this women and youth protocol that AFTA has, it recognizes these challenges and there are provisions to address the problem. So although the protocol requires and asks state parties to act in some ways, it also respects their rights to regulate their own economy without undermining it. So one thing in terms of looking at this protocol I'm talking about is that state parties can adopt policies or laws that affect women and youth traders to achieve their own national policy objectives. In many areas, the protocol also imposes general obligations on state parties and based on which they must take action to achieve specific objectives for women and children. So one of the, and this brings me, this is a very important part of your question, what measures should state parties implement to bridge the digital gaps, addressing challenges that women and youth face. So if state parties adhere to the protocol, then it means that they must take action to, for example, remove tariff and non-tariff barriers, that those barriers affect women and youth, then support women and youth traders to get intellectual property rights protection. They should be able to set up necessary institutional mechanisms, capacity building mechanisms, and that will enable women and youth to effectively participate in digital trade and, to be able to compete on a level with their male counterparts. If you also look at something that is useful in terms of that what the AFCFTA Secretariat is doing is that there is a protocol, based on the protocol, there is a ministerial regulation on preferential market access that is being prepared, which is expected to help ease market access for women and other trading conditions, for women and youth. So when you have these things in place, and state parties would use that ministerial regulation on preferential market access. And not only that, they start to implement specific provisions of the Women and Trade Protocol. You would find that what they're doing is addressing the gaps and the challenges that women face. So I would then say, just on a broader scale, specific ways to address the challenges, even with the protocol, or when you look at protocol, is there has to be policy reforms. I've mentioned one, removing barriers, tariff and non-tariff barriers. Then there has to be capacity building. National offices have to implement programs that enhance the skills of women and youth entrepreneurs, focusing on trade-related skills, financial literacy, and market access. Then there has to be partnership. Without partnership, people will work in silos, and then you will find that nobody is really concerned about what women are struggling, or their voices are not heard. And then there is monitoring and evaluation, which is another very important aspect of something that you want to continue for a long term if you want to support women. And then create financial products or instrument services that are tailored to meet the specific needs of women and youth, not just traders in general. And then finally, I would say a supportive environment. These are what state parties or member state parties can do to support women and youth in trade in Africa.
Thank you so much, Uche, for highlighting the various initiatives that state parties can implement. So moving on from that, I will then ask you this question in terms of new trade and investment opportunities. So how can digital trade tools and emerging technologies be leveraged to unlock new trade and investment opportunities across Africa under the AFCFTA?
Yeah, thanks, Amula. And this is a really good question, because you don't want to have like emerging technologies for emerging technologies' sake. You want to have emerging technology that can unlock new trade and investment opportunities. I think for us, the focus then should be MSMEs. So I would say, with the rise of emerging technologies, businesses are no longer confined by geographical or socioeconomic barriers. Companies are now able to reach and serve customers who were previously beyond their reach. So even just having that in mind, particularly in Africa, where traditional markets often face challenges like limited infrastructure, low digital literacy, and financial exclusion, these innovations are proving to be game changers. And that's just talking broadly. So emerging technologies can play a significant role in unlocking new trade and investment opportunities in Africa. I know that it was projected that AI and other emerging technologies could double the GDP rate of African countries. So this is a big economic benefit, okay? And it comes from just AI and emerging technologies' impact on productivity. So what you have is that in at least three main sectors of the economy, so in agriculture, in industry, and in services, emerging technology can be catalytic or play a catalytic role, however you want to put it, in implementing public and private investment regulation and service delivery. Although one of the challenges would be that that needs to be dealt with within the African context is overcoming inequality, especially ensuring that people are not left behind as jobs continue to change in the wake of new technology. So that's one area. Then we want also think about how AI and emerging technologies have the potential to improve production, provision, and distribution of food, health, water, energy services, while also contributing to towards like a circular economy that steers resources more efficiently to minimize waste. So I think what is really critical here is you think about what AI can do in terms of supply chain, or maybe where you have one person, like where you have one person that has a business that can determine an area where there is a lot of waste is generated, and that waste is plastic waste. If AI can track a lot of data, if somebody has a business, they can determine where collect data on where plastic waste is most. For example, in Abuja, which area you have it most, and then they can use that data to start to when talk about circular waste, to start to recycle products. And one, you can see that it's a new opportunity in terms of business opportunity. It can create more kind of economic benefit, but at the same time you can see the social impact, so it reduces waste in that sense. So that's another area. But I want to talk more a little bit about reducing costs and calculating risks. Okay, so one of the biggest challenges that African entrepreneurs face is reducing their operational costs in industries with like small razor-thin margins, like agricultural, technology, and logistics. If they incorporate AI, which can predict outcomes or automate repetitive tasks, process large volumes of information or data in real time, what will happen is that it will become invaluable for them because it reduces cost and improves efficiency. So AI can help companies turn potential customers into active users. What it does is that it unlocks new revenue streams for them by minimizing human errors and improving decision making, while at the same time simultaneously widening their economic base through increased financial velocity. And I think also want to talk about reaching customers that were previously unreachable is the big thing for businesses, is the big thing for MSMEs. Anybody's thinking, with this technology, I can reach people that I haven't reached before, is the remarkable aspect of emerging technologies. So in Africa, where there is the lack of digital infrastructure and the low digital literacy rates, those are kind of significant barriers. Companies can leverage technologies like speech-to-text, chatbots, and AI-based customer service solutions to reach untapped markets. Then you want to think about localizing solutions for African markets. So, and then scaling ventures with emerging tech. I mean, in terms of localizing solutions, one thing is that AI-powered solutions like language translation, sentiment analysis, behavior prediction models, they can be used to account for local variations and cater to diverse customers. So that's also another, opportunity kind of unlocked. And then, like I said, scaling ventures with emerging techs. This is one of the most exciting aspects of having things like AI and emerging technology to help business scale rapidly across different regions. So in that sense, I think one kind of example is they can make real-time decisions and optimize their operations more efficiently than they used to do with traditional methods. So these are ways, I think definitely for me, Omoblada, these are ways that if you ask that question, how can emerging technology be leveraged to unlock new trade opportunities and investment opportunities? This is one way: scalability, new business areas, more customers. All of these things are things that emerging technology can do.
Thank you so much, Uche. And you've talked about scalability, and that's what AFCFT is about. You've been able to provide goods or services across the 54 state parties. So my next question before the last one, this one is cross-border data flows are critical for digital trade, but also
Mm,
raise concerns around privacy,
mhm,
security, and regulatory control. The AFCFTA Digital Trade Protocol seeks to balance data transfer facilitation with
mm.
personal data protection. As a digital trade expert, what specific measures should state parties adopt to effectively regulate cross-border data flows while leveraging emerging technologies for security and compliance?
Okay. So this is a question that always that is a concern for most people, and we know why. Data is a big deal. So cross-border data flows are critical for digital trade, and the surge in digitalization has been marked by an increase in digital data flows within and across economies. So if you have access to comprehensive data as a business in this digital age, it gives you comparative advantage. But like you said, tracking cross-border data flows is challenging because they raise various policy concerns, increasing economies to either prompting African countries, to either condition data movement or mandate domestic data storage. I think the growth of data flows raises issues, what you mentioned, privacy issues, consumer protection, even competition, cyber security, and national security. And this is why, or this is the reason I think this is the justification or explanation why such flows, why member states would make sure that they have laws in place to restrict data. But I think I would start with just to think of this question. The, there are data regulations that apply to different types of data, okay, and sectors, and they all have different objectives, including personal data protection, national security, digital industrial policy, things like that. So over the years, data localization requirements have increased, in the last decade at least. And I would say that even in Africa, they've become kind of more trade restrictive by mandating stronger domestic storage and processing of data. So the first thing is to look at the different approaches to regulating data flows that have been adopted globally. And depend on type of data and the objectives that the country is pursuing. So the first approach would be involving the complete absence of regulation on cross-border data flows. And usually it's due to the lack of data protection regulation. So this does not involve any form of restriction or movement of data. But actually what it does is that it hinders trade due to trust issues. Because if people don't really trust that, okay, there is data privacy or data protection, people will be reluctant to share their data, right? But then we have kind of the second approach that involves the use of open safeguards regulations, which grants entities, corporations, some discretion in protecting transferred data. This is open, but a bit more balanced. And you would see that this is what the AFCFTA kind of, this is a way that it has a bit of balance that falls within this category. So sometimes in this category, you find that government guidelines are followed, while holding government accountable for any form of data misuse. Then there is the third approach, or holding the company rather accountable for data misuse. So then the third approach is countries can use pre-authorized safeguards, which require government approval before data transfer. And then the fourth approach is ad hoc authorizations that allow data transfer on a case-by-case basis. You can see how cumbersome that would be. I don't even recommend that for countries in Africa. So in terms of these approaches, the first and second one are really what they call open transfer models. So countries with these open transfer models have bigger volumes of trade. And currently in Africa, we have some issues with regulation on cross-border data flows. So we would find that there is countries prioritize their national agendas, which means that laws are distinctive or different in different settings. Even where there is harmonization in Africa at a continental level, the digital policies are often inconsistently applied at the national levels. So you find that some member states implement restrictive measures like data localization that limit free flow of trade. On a continental level, before we get to the AFCFTA, the what we currently have, even though there is no single continental policy on cross-border data flows, there are clear synergies across the various digital policy and legal frameworks. So I'm talking about frameworks like the AU Data Policy Framework that emphasizes the necessity of cross-border data storage, and the Malabo Convention, which then provides the guiding rules to facilitate it, with emphasis on trust and security of personal data. So if these policies, if countries in Africa had tailored their local laws to replicate these policies, then we'd be fine. But again, many countries are still pursuing their own agenda. And I'll talk about what AfTA does in a second. Then we also have as a hindrance the regional economic community. Their policies, they are primarily concentrated on regulating personal data and protecting the rights of data subjects. Now, if we look at the AfTA Digital Trade Protocol, articles 20, 21, and 22 are the ones that, deal with cross-border data flow, data localization, and then, data protection. So generally, the DTP, in terms of this cross-border data localization, seeks to establish a continent-wide framework for data localization and transnational data flows. This policy would ensure that businesses can move data across borders while maintaining compliance with national regulation. And that is what I find that is commendable about the protocol on digital trade. So by standardizing the data governance rules, the DTP aims to reduce the cost and complexity of complying with different national regulations. It means that after digital trade protocol then makes it easier. That's where we implement it, and I'll come to that in a second, for businesses to operate across multiple African markets simultaneously. And then there's also the need you see that in Article 21, there's the need. It states clearly the need for protection of personal data, which will ensure that businesses still adhere to high standards of data privacy and security, even though there's cross-border data flows. So in terms of the provisions I mentioned, Article 20, 21, and 22, they emphasize that free flow of data and still prevent state parties from requiring access to source code as a market access condition. But then the protocol, what it does, Omobola, is that it clarifies that there are exceptions. I think there are criticisms that we will talk about now, but when you look at it holistically and what the AFCFTA is trying to promote, it seems quite balanced, but like I said, it's left for our listeners to weigh it, look at the protocol, to also consider the criticisms I'm going to just mention now and see whether to them they consider it balanced. So where you have a law that allows, or a provision in a framework that emphasizes free flow of data, but at the same time allows for exceptions for legitimate public policy and national security, you find that it seems balanced and falls into that approach, which I mentioned earlier, open transfers, that really gathers more volume of trade. Then in terms of the criticism, the United States, I think last year, one of the biggest proponents of free data flow provisions, retracted its position on, cross-border data flows within the WTO e-commerce plurilateral negotiating context. They cited that they needed to maintain their policy space. So the question is, if the US, who is normally, open and accepting and even promoting cross-border data flows, is now retracting its statements and trying to maintain policy space, if we have these provisions in our digital trade protocol, are we really doing the right thing? Particularly considering, Omobola, that there's the risk of allowing foreign big tech companies to continue their market dominance in Africa and prevent the much needed technology transfer that will benefit Africa's fledgling and growing digital economy. Anyway, what I would say is that this is a question for our audience to consider. This is a question for people to weigh and sort of see where we stand with this, and come to their conclusions. But one thing I would say is that the DTP is commendable because it emphasizes establishing regulatory framework that improves trust. So, for example, state parties are to adopt data protection. I mentioned this earlier. Data protection, consumer protection, and cybersecurity laws which are necessary to ensure trust in digital trade transactions. So to answer the second ambit of your question in just maybe a minute or two, Omola, I would say that the measures I would recommend in the context of the digital trade protocols, and there are other measures that one could take, but I think that we already have the AFCFTA. There's a drive to promote it. There's a drive by massive, corporations, banks in Africa to make sure that the AFCFTA is a go-to. What I would recommend is that state parties implement the DTP, the Digital Trade Protocol, carefully and effectively, make sure there is implementation by ensuring that their national laws and framework are compliant or at least aligned in harmony with the African Digital Trade Protocol provisions on, cross-border data flows and localization. Because ultimately, the provisions on these cross-border data flows, transfers and localization fall within the first and second data transfer approach that I earlier mentioned, that allows for higher volumes of trade. And the DTP balances this out by just saying providing for data protection and cybersecurity laws. So this is a measure I would encourage state parties to take and to approach, whilst at the same time, weighing their own specific circumstances. So
thank you so much, Uche, and thank you for throwing that question for us to ponder on. I'm sure our listeners and policymakers will take all of that into consideration. And finally, the final question. Do you have any other policy recommendations, any additional recommendations to policymakers? This is really usually very key. So thank you. And this will wrap up with this question.
So I think that in terms of policy recommendations, one thing I would say is the digital trade protocol, even after generally, there's talk about implementation across different member states. I would say one thing I would say is, first, there should be kind of quicker, or there should be a bit of the annexes to the digital trade protocol. There should be a quicker kind of or it should be speedily completed, so that people would know what they are doing. That's one thing I would say. I would say capacity building is very important. In fact, Omobola, please take this as my key recommendation. Involving and building the capacity of the private sector and MSMEs is such a critical thing. Making sure that across all the member states or countries that the private sector is involved at every point, at every turn, carrying the private sector along, building their capacity in that regard, being sure that the private sector is involved in what is happening is one way that AFTA can be successfully implemented, and for it to achieve the goals, that it aims to achieve, which is harmonization of laws. And without that, without carrying the private sector, I'm telling you, many MSMEs are not aware of the AFTA rules. They are not aware of AFTA. Some of them are vague about what AFTA is
there needs
about.
to be more awareness.
Yes. Yes. So I think that's my key policy recommendation.
Capacity building, awareness about the AFCFTA, and involvement of the private sector in the implementation of the AFCFTA. Thank you so much, Uche, for joining us today and sharing your insights concerning the digital trade, considering that there is a lot going on within the digital trade space in terms of the digital trade conference coming up soon, and there is in terms of implementing, I think the AFCFTA state parties, that's one key aspect. The protocol are really moving in terms of implementation, and we hope that policymakers can take from this and just implement some of the initiatives you have highlighted. Thank you, Uche, for joining me this afternoon. Thank you to all our listeners, and I hope that we all take some time to ponder on the interesting question that, or the criticism that Uche shared with us. Thank you, and have a wonderful, enjoy the rest of the day rather, because some people might be in the morning, so we are here in the afternoon and also enjoy the rest of the day, everyone. Thank you so much, Uche.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Omobola. It's a pleasure.